Hi, and welcome to the Scrap Elimination video. Today, we're going to be working on creating a strips and braids quilt. So the first thing you have to do is go through all of your scrap pile and really look at what kind of scraps do you have? How big are they? You want to make sure that you have pieces that you can make 6.5 by 2.5 inch pieces for this quilt. This quilt is going to focus on using up big pieces of scrap that you might have and maybe some smaller pieces as well. Okay, so after you have all of your scraps sorted and you have enough that are big enough, what you're going to do is take your ruler and create 2.5 by 6.5 strips. And as you create these strips, kind of keep them in one pile, and we want to go through and iron them, make sure that they're ready to sew and ready to use. Some of your scraps are going to be bigger, so you're going to have like more strips of the same color. You can have all kinds of different patterns, colors, whatever you feel like using is totally usable here. You might even have some strips that are from fat quarters or a jelly roll. So you want to eventually create 36 to 38 pieces for each of your rows. And what I did is I created 7 rows. So basically from a fat quarters, you'll need 12 fat quarters, and one jelly roll will make about 36 pieces per column or row of braid that you're going to create. Okay, so now we're at our sewing machine, and how we're going to do this is we're going to take one strip and then lay another strip from the edges of the 2.5 by 2.5, and you see how I've sewn them together there. So basically you're just bedding up the two pieces together. So one is against the 6.5 side, and there you go. That's what you want it to look like. And then you're going to add, I just finger creased it, and then you're going to add your next piece and bed it up against the 2.5 and 6.5 right there. So as you add each piece, you're just going to keep doing the same motions and adding the pieces so it turns into a little bit of a braid. And you'll notice that as I go, I just check each piece and I make sure that it's finger pressed. And after you do about 4 or 5 pieces together, you can go back and iron. And I added, I think, about 5 or 6 pieces here. So I just wanted you to see what it kind of looks like and how the pieces come together. It's really just at this point going one by one, step by step. There's no real fast way of doing this. It's just one step at a time. So here's 4 pieces added on, and you can see the braid kind of taking shape. And as it's going, I finger press and I add my pieces as I go. And then I keep adding them in and going next, sewing the next piece on. So you want to make sure you're kind of just butting them up against each other and keeping a 1/4 inch seam and just sewing along the seam there. So as you're sewing along and you put together about 5 or 6 pieces, you can go back and press them and make sure that your seams are all pressed down. And it doesn't matter which way you face the seams, they'll just fall whichever way that you've sewn all your pieces together, so you don't need to worry about how they fall. Okay, so after we're done cutting all the pieces and sewing them together, now we get to square all the pieces up. So what I'm doing here is I'm just cutting along the edges of my braids and cutting off the small triangle that's on the very edge of each piece and squaring it up and making sure everything looks even. So your pieces are going to end up being around 7.25 inches wide, and they'll usually end up being about 40 to 45 centimeters long. So not centimeters, inches. So you'll end up with a fairly long piece, and it really just gives you the start of your canvas to work with, and you end up getting 7 rows or columns, and each one of these are sewn together to each one. And so now I'm going back and I'm doing the opposite side and cutting off those corners. And you'll notice it's about 7 inches. Now, there's no hard and fast rule. It doesn't have to be exactly 7 inches or anything like that. It's totally however you want it to look. Very imperfect is fine. It doesn't have to be right on the dot 7 inches. If you want it to be 7 inches, you're more than welcome to square it up to be 7 inches. And then just know that when you put your quilt together, it'll be a little bit smaller. But the quilt itself ends up being about 40 by 40, or a little bit bigger. I think mine ended up overall being 42 by 48, something like that. So that just gives you an idea of how big it will be at the end. So it'll be a nice sized baby quilt. So after you get all of your strips squared up and cut out, you want to take 2 of the strips together and pin them together to get them ready to sew. And as you're pinning, just make sure each of your strips is lining up and all of your seams are facing all down. You'll notice they're all down. So it's just the way it ends up being while you're sewing, they all get pushed down. And I'm just making sure my seams are lining up there and pinning. And when you go across and after you pin, you want to do a 1/4 inch seam along that row from the top to the bottom. So as you sew each and every row or column together, you'll end up with a beautiful piece and it looks really fantastic. I love the way it turned out. It just gives it a little extra flair with all the different colors and it pops and you can find little, things in your fabrics. It just looks beautiful. I hope you really enjoyed this tutorial. If you have any questions or want to connect with me, feel free to reach out on Instagram. I'll be available for any questions or comments. Have a great day.